Hello, what we're going through today is the John Diamanti Fox Solo Clarinet, which is a Kontakt instrument designed and created by Fluffy Audio. This is a follow-up, the second in their wind instruments. The first they did was a flute, which we looked at a few weeks ago, and this is the new clarinet. The interface is very similar to that we've seen before in the flute and in the solo string libraries that this company has also produced. It is intelligent. It is quite well laid out. There's a lot to do. There's a lot of information on each of these screens. Being a Kontakt instrument, of course, you can either hide that away by clicking there, or you can bring it back and show the whole window once you've got everything set up. Of course, you shouldn't really need to be playing with the window at all because it's all fairly automatic. But this is a legato solo instrument that allows you to do legato phrasing, as well as some interesting little nuances that make it a very interesting solo instrument to play. So without any further ado and without talking too much, I'm just going to play some clarinet. I'm going to add to this little performance maybe a few of the key switches and a few of the modulations that you can do on the instrument, and at all times I'll be using CC1, that's the modulation lever or slider on my keyboard, to control the dynamics. So that was a little bit of the vibrato standard articulation that they've produced. When I keep on saying they produced, they've actually gone through this and they've made it incredibly customizable, and we'll look at the customization in a bit. And each of these articulations is fully programmable, so you can decide which attack, which sustain or legato it uses, and then which release samples it uses. There's far too much to edit than there is to show in a simple demonstration like this, but I will try and show what some of it is in a minute. But first, let's just look at the articulations in the front screen. We've got a picture of a solo clarinetist in the middle here with a few of the service keys. These are the kind of the get out of jail free emergency panic keys where everything just returns back to where you want it to go, which is quite nice, as well as having a re-trigger note and a pitch wheel down trigger on G6, and I'll explain why that's quite useful. Down the left hand side you've got the list of articulations, including some standard legato and staccato performance, as well as some growls and some trills, and you heard me use one of the trills in that little piece. And on the right hand side here you've got the mixer window showing you which articulations are being used, the microphones, the close, mid and far mics, a touch of convolution reverb you can add here as well, and you can change which reverb you use later on. And in the next 5 windows, there are 6 windows to this interface. In the next 5 windows you can sculpt the sound using EQs and other DSPs, and this is where you can choose what in convolution reverb you use. The behavior window is where it all happens. This is where you've got complete control over all the different sample sets, and you can decide whether you use a fast attack, slow attack, and different releases. We'll come back to that a little bit later on. In the dynamics window, you can decide whether the software or the scripting tool works out the dynamics and the volumes for you, or whether you have a bit more control over that. And you can decide where the dynamic cross-switching takes place. In other words, which CC number, which level it switches from the MF to the FF or the PP to the MF. So you can actually got a bit of sculpting control there. And then beyond that, you've got this thing called a compensator. I'm not going to touch that. It looks scary. It kind of controls the way the samples respond. And then right on the end there, the preferences window allows you to select which CC controller on your keyboard or which performance controller you've got controls which aspect of the sound. So the standard mod wheel, pitch wheel, expression pedal, and you've got control over synthesized vibrato when you're using the non-vibrato samples as well. On the right hand side you've got control over the accuracy of the engine, in other words how its interpolation of the samples and how it blends samples together, whether it's mediocre, good or excellent. You've got the GUI refresh screen, which gives you just a quick catch up on what's going on with the samples. You can actually turn that right down to virtually no refreshing at all once you've got your performance set up, and it just saves a little tiny bit of CPU. And if you've got any video problems, you can play with that. You've then got the master tune function, which actually works independently from the Kontakt master tune. So be careful if you are using Kontakt to transpose your instruments using its master tune section. This will then change that as well. So you've actually got two ways of detuning. And that can be a bit confusing, so just be aware of that. And then underneath, you've got the humanized tuning. This is actually a very clever idea. For all those wind instrument players who understand wind instruments, when you blow softly, on the whole, with most wind instruments, you tend to flatten the notes ever so slightly, rather like looking sad when you sing. And then when you blow a bit harder and you increase the dynamics, you tend to go a little bit sharper, rather like smiling when you sing. And you can see here we've got control over this humanized tuning. So if you move it right to the right, as you play a note and increase the dynamics, the pitch becomes higher. If you move it to the left, it doesn't do very much at all. If I just move my mod lever up and down, you can see I'm changing the dynamics. If I put the humanize on maximum, you should be able to hear the pitch changing in that note. Obviously that's excessive, although it might work in some kind of jazz context where you really want it to be very expressive and slightly pitchy. So I'm going to leave that somewhere in the middle to make it a little bit more user-friendly. And then we go back to the overview window again. So I'm just going to play through each of the articulations. We've just heard the vibrato, so I'm just going to switch to the non-vibrato using C#1 on the keyboard. And I'm going to play a few things again using the mod lever as a dynamic control. So you've got plenty of dynamic control on each of the legato articulations. So I'm just going to switch to the staccatos now and play each one of those in turn. So something to be aware of, rather like a lot of other monophonic legato instruments, the staccato articulations do not respond to the CC controller. They are velocity responsive. So if you choose the staccato tight, which I've done now, and hit the keys really gently, you get a very quiet tone. Hit them louder. You get a harder tone, which is exactly what you'd expect with a velocity responsive patch. But when you're switching from staccato back to a monophonic sustained legato, you need to be careful that your mod lever or your pitch bend or your control pedal is in the right place. Otherwise, you end up going from a little PP performance on a low velocity to a very harsh tone on the sustained. So what I tend to do is I ride this on my foot pedal and I almost pretend I'm playing the velocity articulations with my foot pedal and try and follow my performance with that. I clearly failed to do that there because I was concentrating on trying to get this done. But if I switch between now the staccato tight and the vibrato standard, but at the same time using my mod lever, I should be able to control it a bit more. So if you're a little bit more careful, you can control that quite well and go between staccato and legato phrasing. So that's the instrument. It's actually a very nice sounding clarinet. It doesn't sound odd. It doesn't sound too screechy or scratchy. It's got some breath noises in there that you can hear, and it's got some nice little note twangs as the performer goes from note to note using the keys. So you've got all the nice sounds you need. The thing that makes this instrument really very clever is in this behavior window here, where you can select different sustain, different attacks, different legato, and different release samples. So down the bottom of the window you can see there are this PW up, PW mid, and PW down, and these lines across here refer to which sample sets the instrument uses when the pitch bend lever is in a different place. They've chosen pitch bend because they've decided not to allow you to use pitch bend to control pitch on this version of the instrument. There is, of course, another version of the instrument which allows you to use pitch bend, but then you don't have this control. So you've got to choose which one you want. I prefer not to have pitch bend control and do it this way. So what you've got here, for instance, is when the pitch bend lever is up, you get an accented sample. When the pitch bend is in the middle, you get a tongued sample, and when the pitch bend is down, you get a crescendo start. So I'll just demonstrate that using the pitch bend. If you look very carefully on the pitch bend lever down the bottom here, you'll see I'm moving it up now and down now. So I'll leave my mouse just underneath it to remind you, and just have a look at that as I play different start notes. So this isn't the legato notes, this is just the first hit note. So that was the normal tongued start, the accented start, a slightly harsher and higher tonal start, and then you've got the crescendo, which is actually really pretty. In the legato phrasing, you can choose between expressive, growl, and detached, and also a glissando legato. And you can see here, it kind of makes sense. If you're using an accented start, you'd use a detached legato. If you're using a normal tongued, you'd use a standard expressive legato. And if you're using a crescendo start, well, why not use a glissando legato? The glissando legato is that lovely kind of jazzy, bendy sound, but it only really works in the higher end of the keyboard when you're blowing a bit harder. So again, some of these samples are recorded at much higher dynamic range, so you can't do from PP and then do a curve up. It just sounds wrong. So I'm going to put the mod lever somewhere up near the top and just demonstrate these three different legatos now. So you heard there a standard détaché legato, the expressive legato, which is our standard legato, and then the glissando. And as you heard, the glissando only really works when notes are next to each other. The trigger only works when you're playing chromatic scales. So for the thirds and the fifths that I was playing, it did nothing. But then when I played a semitone up, it gave a nice little curve, and you can hear it was a little bit harsher recording. And of course that kind of works. You're not going to do that kind of legato with very low dynamics. And then finally at the very end there, you heard the decrescendo, which I'd left the mod lever in the low position, taken my finger off the button, the key, and then the sound gently faded out. They've recorded the decrescendo really quite long, and then you can just ride the mod lever and bring that back down to fade it out. You've got various round robin releases. You've got staccatos 1, 2, 3, 4. So I'm going to just choose, you won't really tell the difference, you won't be able to see the difference or hear the difference really between the staccato releases because they're very subtle, but I will just play the decrescendo release again. So you could hear the player there just running out of steam as they slowed down the velocity of air through the mouthpiece. So it's quite a nice sound. It's a very expressive sound. So that's the first page of the behavior, and you've got full control over all these different trills, growls. It's amazing what you can do with the various pitch bend positions. It's just a shame there aren't more, but I guess it would be very hard to play multiple releases and sustains using a single pitch bend lever. I think up, down, mid is quite a good way. On the second page, you've then got the ifs and whys and wherefores of this. So you can set that if the velocity is higher than a certain velocity, it would play a certain type of sample. So for instance here I can say if velocity is higher than 95, then start with an accented. Actually, no, let's start with a trill. Let's make runs really fun. So now if I play a melody line and I hit a key, not a legato phrase, but I hit the start of the key at greater than a velocity of 85, it should then play a trill for me. So you may not want to do that every day of your life, but it is quite nice that you have the opportunity to do that should you want to without having to use a key switch. You've then got the option to have a second option, so you can choose mod wheel positions, velocities, speed of playing. So if you play lower than 5 milliseconds, it'll start a growl or whatever. So it's actually quite a clever way of doing it. You'd have to have a reason to want to do this rather than using key switches, but I can see that it could be a useful thing to develop on. And underneath there you've got the synth vibrato, which is very handy to add a bit of natural synthesized vibrato to a non-vibrato sample. The samples used in this are obviously recorded with vibrato on the whole, apart from the non-vibrato performance. So if I just use the Kontakt learn, just to remove that one, and learn a MIDI controller for that, so there we are. There we are. So I've just learnt a new slider. I think my other sliders have been used by other things. So there's that slider being learnt. Let's go to the non-vibrato and add, there we are, the synth vibrato is added. So let's go back to the overview, choose non-vibrato, and now you should be able to hear some of the synthesized vibrato. Okay, so it is very synthesized. It's got that slight kind of tremolo vibrato sound to it. I can see it being useful in the background. It wouldn't make a particularly good solo performance, but you can see it'd be quite nice to have non-vibrato samples with vibrato coming in. They've done the same, I think, with their strings on the non-vibrato samples, and I think it works quite well there. And it works on the flute. We've tried that before. So I think they can develop that, but it's actually a really good start to give you that option. So this is the John Diamanti Fox Solo Clarinet. It's a lovely sounding instrument. You can play some really nice tones with it. You've got control over the environment you work in. You've got control over the instrumentation to some degree. And the tone is very pretty. I mentioned at the beginning that we've got these 3 magic buttons. You're playing a vibrato note and you've just going through a legato articulation. It'll take you back to your sustain sound, which you've got over here. So I'll just play a couple of notes. I can't actually hear that doing anything, but I'm sure it's doing something. G6, the key up, allows you to use the pitch wheel down as a key shortcut. That could be quite good for programming if you just want to quickly program in, for instance, a slow crescendo start. So if I just press the G button and then play a note, you've got there a crescendo start, so that's quite handy. And then it obviously forgets when you release the key and carries on going. And then the re-trigger note on A6, basically you can play the same note legato. So So it's very handy to have that too. So just remember where those notes are, because of course other instruments use different notes for those kind of functions. So there we are. That's the software as it is. Very impressive for a first release. It seems to do the job very nicely. It was on sale. I don't know if it's still on sale now at, I think, 79 euros or dollars or something equivalent to that. Not an expensive clarinet, and sure, if you want to go and buy something really expensive, there are lots of other options out there to spend far more money on something that probably doesn't sound much better. So consider getting that. It's a great new addition to your orchestral solo libraries.